The wind came down hard from the north, carrying ice and memories. Jacob Harrow felt both cut through him as he trudged across the snow-crusted ridge, checking the wolf traps he had set 3 days prior. December in Wyoming Territory, 1874, was unforgiving to careless men, and Jacob had survived this long by never being careless. He paused at the edge of Blackwater Ridge, squinting against the late afternoon sun. Something moved at the tree line, a flicker of shadow that vanished when he turned his head fully toward it. Man or beast he couldn't tell, but his hand instinctively drifted to the Springfield rifle slung across his back. After 2 wars and 6 winters alone in these mountains, Jacob trusted his instincts more than his eyes. The old dog at his side, a gray-muzzled wolfhound named simply Wolf, lifted his head and sniffed the air, but gave no warning growl. Whatever had moved was gone now, or perhaps had never been there at all. "Getting jumpy in your old age," Jacob muttered to himself, adjusting the worn cavalry hat that shielded his weathered face from the wind. At 52, he wasn't ancient, but the years had carved deep lines around his eyes and threaded silver through his once dark beard. Blackwater Ridge stood 40 miles from the nearest settlement, a distance that suited Jacob fine. His cabin perched on the high ground, backed against stone that blocked the worst of the wind, with sightlines in every direction. No one approached without being seen, and few had reason to make the journey, just how he wanted it. As darkness gathered, Jacob made his way back to the cabin, Wolf padding silently beside him. The first flakes of new snow began to fall as they reached the cleared space around the structure, a sturdy hand-hewn affair, built by Jacob himself after he'd left everything behind. Inside, he lit the lamp and stoked the banked fire to life, shrugging off his heavy coat. The cabin's interior was sparse but practical. A rough-hewn table with a single chair, a bed with wool blankets, a shelf holding few possessions, ammunition tools, and a Bible with a spine so cracked and worn that the gold lettering had all but vanished. Beside it, face down, lay a small tintype photograph that Jacob never displayed but couldn't bring himself to burn. Wolf settled by the fire with a groan of old bones, and Jacob hung his rifle on pegs above the door. As he moved to the stove to heat coffee, his eyes drifted to the small trunk beneath his bed, where he kept the things he tried not to remember: Sarah's wedding band, Emma's tiny dress, and the faded letter offering condolences for their deaths. 6 years had passed since the smallpox took them both in the spring of 1868. 6 years since he'd watched the soil cover their coffins. 6 years since he'd last spoken from a pulpit or opened that Bible except to stare at the inside cover where Sarah had written their names in her elegant hand. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin like a lost soul. Jacob poured coffee into a tin cup and sat heavily in the chair, feeling the familiar ache in his left leg where a Confederate bullet had found him at Gettysburg. He'd fought through that war, believing in something: God, country, the Union, only to return home and lose everything that mattered anyway. What God allowed such things? What God took a 5-year-old girl while her father watched helplessly? What God left a man alive when everything worth living for was gone? These were the questions that had driven him from his pulpit, from civilization, from faith itself. Here in the silence of the mountains, he didn't have to pretend he had answers. Wolf's head suddenly lifted, ears pricked forward. A low growl rumbled in the old dog's chest. Jacob set down his cup, listening. The wind made it difficult to hear anything else, but Wolf's reaction was unmistakable. Someone was outside. He reached for the rifle, checking that it was loaded, before moving silently to the window. Through the frost-edged glass, he could see nothing but swirling snow in the gathering darkness. Then came the sound, faint but unmistakable. A knock at the door. Not the heavy pounding of a man seeking shelter, but something weaker, almost hesitant. 3 soft raps that nearly disappeared into the howl of the wind. Jacob held the rifle ready, nodding to Wolf, who took position beside him. In 6 years, no one had come to his door uninvited. The few travelers who passed through these parts knew to avoid the cabin of the man locals called the Preacher, despite his having abandoned that title long ago. "Who's there?" he called, voice rough from disuse. No answer came, only another series of weak knocks. Cautiously, Jacob unbolted the door and pulled it open, a crack rifle at the ready. The wind drove snow into his face, momentarily blinding him. When his vision cleared, he found himself staring not at a threat, but at desperation itself. A woman stood there, swaying slightly on her feet. Her clothes, once fine but now tattered, were crusted with ice and dirt. Her face was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and dark circles beneath blue eyes that held both fear and determination. Behind her stood a boy of perhaps 10 thin arms wrapped protectively around a smaller girl who clutched a bundle to her chest. "Please," the woman said, her voice cracking from cold and exhaustion. "My children haven't eaten in 3 days." She swallowed hard, forcing out words that clearly cost her pride. "I'll be yours forever if you feed them." She couldn't meet his eyes as she said it, her gaze fixed somewhere around his chest. The boy behind her tensed, as if preparing to catch her should she fall. Jacob stood frozen, memories washing over him like the bitter wind. Another woman, another time, desperate eyes looking to him for salvation he couldn't provide. "Please," she whispered again, the word barely audible. Wolf, who normally growled at strangers, moved forward and nudged the woman's hand with his muzzle. The small girl behind her gave a soft gasp of fear, but the dog merely sniffed her, then turned expectantly to Jacob. Jacob stepped back without a word, opening the door wider. The invitation was clear. The woman stumbled forward, the children following close behind. In the lamplight, Jacob could see them more clearly. The boy was rail-thin, but stood protectively, straight eyes darting around the cabin, assessing threats and exits. The girl, perhaps 6, had sharp, intelligent eyes despite her hollow cheeks, and the bundle, which Jacob now realized was an infant wrapped in what looked like a man's coat, let out a dry, hiccuping cry that sounded more like a wheeze than a child's wail. "Sit," Jacob said, gesturing to the chair while he bolted the door against the storm. He set his rifle aside, but within reach, caution born of experience. The woman remained standing, swaying slightly. "The children first," she said. Jacob nodded, moving to the stove where a pot of bean soup had been simmering. He filled a bowl and handed it to the boy, then repeated the action for the girl. He pulled hardtack from a tin and set it before them. The boy hesitated only a moment before hunger overwhelmed caution. He broke the hardtack into the soup and began to eat with controlled desperation, each bite measured as if to make it last. The girl followed suit, though her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the spoon. Only when the children had food did the woman finally sink into the offered chair, the infant clutched tight against her chest. Her eyes never left Jacob, wary even in her exhaustion. "The baby," Jacob said, nodding toward the bundle. "Her name is Mary," the woman replied softly. "She's 8 weeks old." Jacob moved to the shelf and took down a small bottle of whiskey medicinal rarely touched. He poured a drop onto his finger and carefully touched it to the infant's lips. The baby's reflexive suck was weak but present. "She needs milk," he said. "I have none." "Water," the woman said. "Anything. Her voice broke. "She's not had enough." Jacob filled a tin cup with water from the kettle and handed it to her along with a clean cloth. The woman dipped the cloth into the water and squeezed small drops into the infant's mouth with practiced motions that spoke of days doing the same. While she tended to the baby, Jacob filled another bowl with soup and set it beside her along with his own portion of hardtack. Only then did he think to ask, "What's your name?" "Hannah," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Hannah Grace. My son is Asa. My daughter is Ruthie." Jacob nodded, not offering his own name in return. If they'd come this far into the wilderness, they likely already knew who he was, or at least what the locals said about him. The boy Asa had finished his soup and was watching Jacob with wary calculation. Not with fear, Jacob noted, but with the look of someone measuring a potential threat. The girl Ruthie had slowed her eating, as if suddenly remembering manners despite her hunger. "You're running from something," Jacob said finally, the words not a question. Hannah didn't answer, her attention fixed on feeding drops of water to the infant. "Someone's chasing you." Jacob pressed his voice low and even. Still no answer, but Asa's shoulders tensed visibly. That was answer enough. "I don't care why," Jacob said, moving to stoke the fire. "Just don't bring trouble to my door." Hannah looked up, then her blue eyes suddenly fierce despite her exhaustion. "We didn't have a choice." Jacob met her gaze and saw truth there. He'd seen that look before in soldiers cornered by enemy forces and civilians fleeing advancing armies. The look of someone who'd run out of options. He nodded once, understanding more than she could know. "You can stay the night," he said. "Just the night. Storm's too bad to travel anyway." Relief flooded her face, but it was quickly replaced by wariness again. "Thank you," she said, the words sounding unpracticed, as if gratitude was a language she'd forgotten. Jacob spread his bedroll near the fire for the children. The boy protested weakly that he could sleep on the floor, but exhaustion won out. Within minutes, Asa and Ruthie were asleep, curled around each other like puppies seeking warmth. Hannah settled in a corner with the baby, refusing the offered bed with a shake of her head. Jacob took the chair rifle across his knees, prepared to keep watch through the night. Outside, the storm grew fiercer snow, driving against the windows with increasing fury. The wind found every crack in the cabin's walls, whispering secrets Jacob didn't want to hear. Sometime past midnight, as the fire burned low, Hannah spoke again. "He'll find us," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the storm. "He always does." Jacob didn't ask who he was. It didn't matter. Whatever demon pursued this woman and her children had nothing to do with him. Come morning, they would go their way, and he would return to his solitude. One night of charity didn't change anything. But as the hours passed and the storm howled around them, Jacob found himself watching the woman's face in the firelight. The way her arms never loosened their protective hold on the infant, even in sleep. The way the boy had positioned himself between the door and his family, even unconscious. These weren't ordinary travelers caught in bad weather. These were people fighting for their lives. Just before dawn, Jacob dozed briefly. He awoke with a start, some soldier's instinct pulling him from sleep. Something had changed. He listened carefully, realizing what had caught his attention. The storm had stopped. In the sudden silence, another sound became clear. Hoofbeats distant, but approaching. Wolf was already on his feet. Hackles raised a low growl building in his throat. Hannah sat bolt upright, terror washing over her face. "He's found us," she whispered. Jacob moved swiftly to the window, peering out at the snow-covered landscape now bathed in the gray light of dawn. A lone rider approached along the ridge, following their tracks from the previous night. Even at this distance, Jacob could see the man rode like a soldier, back straight, shoulders squared. A rifle was slung across his back, and the horse beneath him was a big bay the kind cavalrymen favored. "Get the children into the root cellar," Jacob ordered, reaching for his rifle. "Now." Hannah didn't argue, quickly waking Asa and Ruthie. The boy came alert instantly, eyes wide but movements controlled. He helped his mother lift the trap door in the corner, while Jacob loaded his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Who is he?" Jacob asked as Hannah herded the children toward the cellar. "His name is Boone Mallory," she replied, voice tight with fear. "He was my husband's foreman. After my husband died." She shook her head, unable to continue. "He claims I'm his property now," she finally managed. "Says I owe him." Jacob's jaw tightened. He'd heard of such arrangements, women left widowed with few options, forced into relationships with whoever could provide. But the fear in Hannah's eyes spoke of something darker than mere economic desperation. "Stay down there until I come for you," he said, motioning toward the cellar. "No matter what you hear." Asa hesitated at the entrance to the cellar, looking back at Jacob. "He kills people," the boy said quietly. "Says he'll do the same to us if we don't go with him." Jacob met the boy's eyes and saw something familiar there. Not just fear, but the determination to protect what was his, despite that fear. It was a look Jacob had seen in soldiers much older than this child. "Go," Jacob said softly. "I'll handle this." As the cellar door closed, Jacob positioned himself near the window, angling for a clear shot if needed. Wolf stood beside him, ears forward, a continuous growl rumbling from his chest. The rider had stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. He sat motionless in the saddle, as if waiting for something. After a long moment, he raised a hand in greeting, or perhaps warning. Jacob didn't respond, just watched through the rifle's sights. The man nudged his horse forward again, closing the distance slowly, deliberately. Now Jacob could see him clearly, tall, broad-shouldered, with a full beard and a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore a long coat over what looked like an old cavalry uniform, though any insignia had been removed. A revolver hung at his hip, and the rifle across his back was a Spencer carbine, standard issue for Union cavalry during the war. The rider stopped 30 yards out, just far enough to be a difficult shot in the morning breeze. His hands remained visible, away from his weapons. A deliberate choice that spoke of confidence rather than surrender. "Jacob Harrow," the man called, his voice carrying easily across the snow. "Been a long time." Jacob stiffened. The man knew him, which meant, "Lieutenant Harrow," the rider continued, a smile spreading across his bearded face. "Or should I say preacher? Didn't expect to find you all the way out here." With a jolt of recognition, Jacob placed him. Sergeant Boone Mallory, 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. They'd fought together at Gettysburg and through the Wilderness Campaign. After the war, they'd both joined the Riders of Justice, a group of veterans who'd appointed themselves law enforcers in the chaotic Western territories, until Jacob had witnessed what that justice really meant and walked away. "What do you want, Mallory?" Jacob called back, not lowering his rifle. Boone's smile didn't waver. "Just looking for what's mine, a woman and 3 children. Tracks led right to your door." He spread his hands. "No quarrel with you, Pritchard. Just give them over, and I'll be on my way." "There's nothing here that belongs to you," Jacob replied evenly. Boone's smile faded slightly. "The woman made a deal. Her husband died owing me money. She agreed to work it off. Not with me, she didn't. She was mine before she ran." Boone's voice hardened. "She knows it. Ask her." Jacob didn't look away from the sights. "She's free to go where she pleases." Boone's expression darkened. His hand drifted closer to his revolver. "You sure you want to get in the middle of this preachers after what happened last time you took up a cause?" The reference to Jacob's past struck like a physical blow, but he kept his aim steady. "Already am." For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Boone's hand dropped away from his weapon, and he sat back in the saddle. "I'll come again," he said, voice carrying clearly across the snow. "With more men. Don't make me burn you out, Harrow." "You won't like how that ends," Jacob replied flatly. Boone studied him for another moment, then turned his horse with military precision and rode back the way he'd come. Jacob watched until the rider disappeared over the ridge, only then allowing his shoulders to relax slightly. When he opened the cellar door, Hannah stood at the bottom of the steps, baby clutched to her chest, tears trailing silently down her face. "I can't let him kill you," she whispered. Jacob didn't turn, just kept his eyes on the empty ridge where Boone had vanished. "You're not letting me do anything," he said quietly. "I decide who I protect." And for the first time since she'd arrived, Hannah seemed to truly see him not as a potential savior or threat, but as a man making a choice that was entirely his own. Wolf came to stand beside Jacob, still alert, still watching the horizon where the rider had disappeared. In the cellar below, Ass's thin arms circled his sister's shoulders, his young face set in lines too old for his years. Jacob knew that Boone wasn't bluffing. He would return, and when he did, he wouldn't be alone. The storm had passed, but darker clouds were gathering on the horizon. The day after Boone's visit dawned clear and cold, the storm having scoured the sky to a brittle blue. Jacob stood on his porch, Winchester in hand, scanning the horizon for movement. Nothing stirred but the occasional raven flapping heavily across the snow. Behind him, the cabin door opened, and Hannah stepped out. She'd washed her face and combed her hair, with Jacob's old wooden comb making her look less like a ghost and more like a woman. Still, exhaustion hung on her like a shroud. "You know him," she said, "not a question." Jacob nodded, eyes still on the horizon. "We fought together, long time ago. In the war, and after." Jacob turned to face her. "Your husband, his name was Jeremiah Grace." Hannah's eyes widened slightly. "Yes, how did you Echo Valley?" Jacob said. "That's where you're from, where Jeremiah had his ranch." She nodded slowly, wariness returning to her gaze. "You know of it. I know of it." Jacob's jaw tightened. "And I know of Boone's activities there." After the war, many veterans had struggled to find their place in a nation eager to forget the bloodshed. Some, like Jacob, had turned to God. Others, like Boone, had turned to the only thing they truly understood: violence wrapped in the guise of authority. The Riders of Justice, they'd called themselves a band of former Union soldiers who'd appointed themselves enforcers of order in the chaotic Western territories. They'd started with noble intentions, hunting actual outlaws, protecting settlers from bandits. But power corrupts, and Boone had taken to his role with particular zeal. When Jacob found them hanging a Mexican farmer for a crime he couldn't possibly have committed, he'd walked away. That had been 5 years ago. "He said you took up a cause before," Hannah said cautiously. "What did he mean?" Jacob's eyes hardened. "Nothing that matters now." He turned back to the cabin, signaling an end to the conversation. Inside, Asa was stoking the fire while Ruthie sat nearby, holding baby Mary and humming softly. "We'll leave today," Hannah said, following him inside. "The storm's passed. We've imposed enough." "And go where?" Jacob asked bluntly. Hannah had no answer. Boone will be back by nightfall tomorrow, Jacob continued, with men. He won't come alone next time. Then we'll be gone before he returns, Hannah insisted. We've brought enough trouble to your door. Jacob studied her for a moment. The stubborn set of her jaw reminded him of Sarah, who'd never backed down from what she believed was right, even when it cost her. 30 miles to the nearest town, he said, through snow 3 feet deep in places. With 3 children, 1 an infant. You won't make 5 miles before dark. Asa looked up from the fire, his young face serious. I can walk far, he said. I can carry Ruthie. Jacob shook his head. Not in this snow, boy. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and Mary's soft whimpering. The infant's cry sounded weaker than it had the night before. Jacob noted with concern. If we can't leave and we can't stay. Hannah's voice trailed off, the impossible situation hanging in the air between them. Jacob moved to the window, checking the horizon again. We prepare, he said simply. He spent the morning teaching Asa how to secure the cabin, which boards to nail across which windows, how to create firing positions where the weak points were. The boy absorbed every word with intense concentration, his small hands working diligently alongside Jacob's larger ones. You've done this before, Asa observed as they reinforced the door. Been in sieges, you mean? Jacob asked. Asa nodded. Petersburg, Jacob said after a moment. 72 days behind fortifications, not much better than these. The Rebs nearly broke through a dozen times. Did you kill people? The boy asked quietly. Jacob paused in his hammering. Yes. Was it hard? The first time, Jacob admitted. Gets easier, that's the problem. Asa absorbed this with a solemn nod that made him seem far older than his years. Boone enjoys it, he said. Killing. I saw his face when he... The boy trailed off, swallowing hard. Jacob put a hand on the boy's shoulder. You're not him, he said firmly. And you never have to be. Inside, Hannah was tending to Mary, whose cough had worsened overnight. The infant's breathing came in wheezing gasps that worried Jacob more than he let on. He'd seen lung fever take children before even strong ones. This frail infant, already weakened by hunger and cold. While Asa continued securing the windows, Jacob took Hannah aside. The baby needs medicine, he said quietly. Hannah nodded, her face tight with worry. I know, but there's none to be had. I have willow bark, Jacob offered, for fever, and some honey for the cough. Thank you, Hannah whispered, her composure cracking slightly. I can't lose her. Jacob recognized the raw fear in her eyes, the same fear he'd felt watching Emma's fever rise, helpless to stop it. You said Boone was your husband's foreman, he said, changing the subject. There's more to it than that. Hannah glanced at the children, then nodded toward the door. They stepped outside where their words wouldn't be overheard. Jeremiah was a good man, she began, rubbing her arms against the cold. Older than me by 20 years. We married 4 years ago when my father died and left me with nothing. Jeremiah offered security kindness. He wasn't... She hesitated. It wasn't a love match, but there was respect. Jacob nodded, understanding the practical arrangements that often constituted marriage in the territories. Boone came 2 years ago, Hannah continued. Jeremiah hired him to manage the ranch hands, most of whom were Mexican or Chinese. Boone had been a cavalry sergeant, had experience with horse and men. But he was... She shuddered. He was cruel to the workers. Violent. Jeremiah didn't see it at first. And then, Jeremiah fell ill last winter. Consumption. Before he died, he changed his will, leaving everything to me instead of his brother in St. Louis. Her eyes hardened. Boone had expected to be made foreman permanently with a share of the profits. Instead, he was working for a woman half his age. He didn't take it well, Jacob guessed. He started coming to the house at all hours, making suggestions, offers. Hannah's voice tightened. Said I couldn't run the ranch alone. Said I needed a man. When I refused him, he became insistent. He hurt you, Jacob observed, noting again the fading bruises on her wrists. Hannah nodded. After Mary was born, she's Jeremiah's child. His last gift to me, Boone became obsessed. Said no other man's child would be raised in his house. Said if I didn't agree to his terms, he'd make sure neither of us survived the winter. So you ran. Our housekeeper, an old Mexican woman named Elena, helped us escape. She... Hannah's voice broke. Boone caught her helping us. He shot her in front of Asa, made him watch. Jacob's jaw tightened. The Boone he'd known during the war had been hard, sometimes brutal, but not sadistic. Power and isolation had clearly warped whatever humanity the man once possessed. "The papers," Jacob said. "You took them with you." Hannah looked surprised. "How did you know?" "It's what I would have done," Jacob replied. "Boone wants the ranch. Legally, it's yours, without proof of ownership." "I hid them," Hannah confirmed. "Sewed them into Mary's blanket. They're all I have left of Jeremiah's legacy for his children." Jacob nodded, understanding now the full weight of what was at stake. This wasn't just about a man's obsession with a woman. It was about land power and the future of 3 children. As they returned to the cabin, a sound stopped Jacob in his tracks. Wolf, who had been patrolling the perimeter as he did each morning, let out a sharp, pained yelp that cut off abruptly. Jacob grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the cabin wall, motioning for Hannah to get inside. He moved swiftly toward the sound, circling the back of the cabin where Wolf had gone. The dog lay in the snow, blood pooling beneath him from a single gunshot wound to the chest. His eyes were already glazing over, life fading quickly. Jacob knelt beside the faithful companion who had guarded his solitude for 6 years, gently stroking the gray muzzle one last time. "Good dog," he whispered. "Good boy." Embedded in the snow beside Wolf's body was a wooden stake with a note nailed to it. "Return what's mine. BM." Jacob's blood ran cold. The shot had come from the ridge to the east, at least 400 yards away. A warning and a demonstration of skill. Boone could have just as easily put that bullet through Jacob's head or Hannah's or one of the children's. That he'd chosen the dog instead was calculated cruelty, meant to show what would come next. When Jacob returned to the cabin, his face told Hannah everything before he spoke. "We need to move faster," he said grimly. "They're already watching." The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. Jacob retrieved his military chest from beneath the floorboards, something he hadn't opened in years. Inside lay his service revolver, a Colt Army model 1860, still cleaned and oiled despite years of disuse, extra ammunition, a Bowie knife with a bone handle, and the silver pocket watch Sarah had given him before he'd left for war, inscribed with words he no longer believed: "The Lord is my shepherd." He gave the smaller Whitney revolver to Asa, showing the boy how to load and fire it. The weapon was almost too heavy for the child's hands, but Asa held it with grim determination. "Only if they get inside," Jacob instructed. "Only if there's no other choice." Hannah watched from across the room, her face pale but resolute. She'd put aside whatever moral qualms she might have had about arming a child. Survival had become the only concern. As evening approached, Jacob surveyed their preparations. The cabin was as secure as it could be made. Food and water had been stored in the root cellar, along with extra blankets and ammunition. Escape routes had been planned, though Jacob harbored no illusions about their chances if it came to flight. Hannah had been quiet throughout the afternoon, focusing on caring for Mary, whose breathing seemed to ease slightly with the honey and willow bark tea Jacob had prepared. Now, as darkness fell, she approached Jacob, where he stood by the window. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You don't know us. You owe us nothing." Jacob continued to scan the horizon where the setting sun painted the snow-covered hills in shades of blood and gold. "I knew men like Boone during the war," he said finally, "men who found purpose in violence, who confused power with righteousness." He glanced at her. "I was almost one of them." "What changed?" Jacob's eyes darkened with memory. "I saw what we were becoming, what I was becoming." Before Hannah could press further, Ruthie's frightened voice called from across the room. "Mama Mary's not breathing right." Hannah rushed to the children. Jacob followed, watching as she lifted the infant, whose tiny chest heaved with the effort to draw breath. Mary's face had taken on a bluish tinge, her wheezing audible even from several feet away. "She's burning up," Hannah said, panic edging into her voice as she felt the baby's forehead. Jacob recognized the symptoms immediately. Pneumonia, the killer of infants and elderly, especially in winter. Without proper medicine, he made a swift decision. "There's a doctor in Laramie, Clement. Good man." "Laramie is 30 miles, Hannah protested. "In this snow." "I can make it by tomorrow noon if I push hard," Jacob interrupted. "The storm's passed. Trail will be passable." "You can't go," Hannah said, her voice dropping. Boone expects us to run or hide," Jacob countered. He won't expect me to ride out. Might buy us time. I should go, Hannah insisted. She's my child. Jacob shook his head. You wouldn't make it 10 miles in this cold, and the children need you here. He looked at Asa. The boy's been taught. He'll help you defend if it comes to that. Asa straightened at this expression of confidence, though fear flickered in his eyes. If something happens to her, because I didn't try. Hannah's voice broke, and Jacob saw in her face the same helpless terror he'd felt watching Emma slip away. I'll go, he said firmly. I'll bring back medicine. The decision made Jacob prepared swiftly. He packed light, jerky hardtack, a water skin wrapped to prevent freezing, his Springfield rifle, the Colt revolver, extra ammunition. He donned his heaviest coat and wrapped a wool scarf around his neck. Before leaving, he took Hannah aside and gave her final instructions. If I'm not back by tomorrow night, don't wait. Take the children and head southwest through the draw. There's a trapper's cabin 8 miles down. Mitchell, tell him I sent you. Hannah nodded, her face pale in the lamplight. Jacob, she said, using his name for the first time. Thank you. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the risk he was taking, of the trust she was placing in him. For a moment, he saw not just gratitude in her eyes, but something warmer, more complex. Then Mary coughed weakly, breaking the moment. Hannah pressed a folded paper into Jacob's hand. Give this to Dr. Clement. He'll remember me. Jacob raised an eyebrow in question. My sister, Hannah explained softly. She died last year. Clement treated her and me back when we still had names that mattered. Jacob tucked the note into his coat pocket without comment. The past had a way of connecting people in unexpected ways out here, where civilization was still more aspiration than reality. He mounted his horse, an aging bay gelding that had carried him faithfully for years, and looked back at the cabin. Hannah stood in the doorway, Mary in her arms, with Asa and Ruthie flanking her like small sentinels. Bolt the door, Jacob ordered. Don't open it for anyone but me. As he rode away, the weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, heavier than it had been in years. For so long, he'd been accountable only to himself, answering to no one, protecting nothing he couldn't bear to lose. Now suddenly, everything had changed. 4 lives depended on his return. 4 souls he'd known for barely a day yet, who had somehow breached the fortress of solitude he'd built around himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years after Sarah and Emma died, he'd prayed for death to take him too. When God refused that mercy, Jacob had stopped praying altogether. Now, as he urged his horse through the deepening twilight, he found himself making bargains with the deity he'd renounced. Just let me get there in time. Just let me bring back what they need. Take me if you must, but spare the child. The cold bit it through his layers as night fell completely. Jacob rode steadily, navigating by stars and memory. The trail to Laramie was treacherous in the best conditions. In winter, with snowdrifts higher than a horse's chest, in places it was a gamble with death. He pushed on through the night, stopping only briefly to rest his horse and chew a piece of jerky that tasted like leather in his dry mouth. By dawn, his beard was crusted with ice from his frozen breath, and he'd lost feeling in his toes despite the thick wool socks. The sunrise revealed a landscape both beautiful and deadly, endless, white rolling hills beneath a sky so blue it hurt the eyes. No sign of pursuit behind him, which could mean either that Boone hadn't yet arrived at the cabin or that he was content to wait for Jacob's return. Neither possibility offered much comfort. By mid-morning, Jacob encountered another rider, a solitary figure heading west on a mule. He tensed, hand dropping to his revolver, but relaxed slightly when he recognized Sam Blackwood, an aging trapper who worked these mountains. "Harrow," Sam greeted, pulling his mule alongside Jacob's horse. "Mighty cold day for a ride." "Heading to Laramie," Jacob replied tersely. "Doctor." Sam's bushy eyebrows rose above eyes narrowed by decades squinting against snow glare. "You don't look sick." "Not for me. Got a sick infant back at the cabin." Sam studied him with the keen assessment of a man who'd survived 60 winters in the wilderness. "Yours?" He asked the question, weighted with meaning. "No." Jacob saw no point in elaboration. Sam nodded, apparently satisfied. "Heard tell of riders asking about a woman and children," he said casually. "Over Echo Valley Way." Jacob's spine stiffened. When 2 days passed, 4 or 5 men, led by a big fellow with a Spencer carbine and a mean look. Sam scratched his gray-streaked beard. Name of Boone or some such. You know him? Jacob asked sharply. Know of him, Sam corrected. Been causing trouble in Echo Valley past year or so. Calls himself Law. But law don't usually help itself to other folks' property. The old trapper spat into the snow. Or other folks' wives. While Jacob absorbed this confirmation of Hannah's story, he say where he was headed. Didn't speak to him direct, Sam replied. But word is he's looking to make an example. Says the woman stole something valuable. Says he'll burn out anyone harboring her. The trapper fixed Jacob with a knowing look. Cabin got any new occupants I should know about? Jacob hesitated, then decided that if Boone was already spreading word, there was little point in secrecy. Woman and 3 children, he confirmed. Youngest is sick. Lung fever, I think. Sam whistled low. Boone's not one to give up easy. Man's building himself a little kingdom in Echo Valley. Got the local law in his pocket. Even rumor of a federal judge backing his claims. The trapper leaned forward. What did the woman take that's got him so fired up? Land deeds, Jacob said. Her husband left her the ranch. Boone wants it. Sam nodded slowly. That'd do it. Echo Valley's good grazing. Railroad survey came through last fall. Land values are set to triple. He studied Jacob's face. You know you're riding into a hornet's nest, don't you? Boone's got men in Laramie, too. Don't have a choice, Jacob replied grimly. Child won't last without medicine. The trapper considered this, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Elkshorn root, he said, handing it to Jacob. Brew it strong, add honey if you got it. Won't cure lung fever, but might keep the child breathing till you get back with proper medicine. Jacob accepted the package with genuine gratitude. Much obliged. Sam waved off his thanks. One more thing you should know, he added, his voice dropping. Boone's revived the old Riders of Justice name. Got about 15 men riding with him now. Calls them his deputies. The trapper's eyes narrowed. Word is they're planning something big, clearing out undesirables from the valley. Jacob's blood ran cold. He knew what that meant. The original riders had started with outlaws, then moved on to anyone they deemed troublesome, mostly immigrants, Indians, or settlers who refused to sell land at cheap prices. When, he asked, soon as the weather breaks proper, week maybe less. Sam adjusted his worn hat. Whatever you're planning, Harrow, do it quick. They parted ways, Sam continuing west, while Jacob pushed on toward Laramie with renewed urgency. The trapper's news had confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just about Hannah and her children anymore. Boone was building an army preparing for a purge that would cost innocent lives. History was repeating itself, and once again Jacob found himself unwillingly at its center. By early afternoon, the distant smoke of Laramie's chimneys came into view. Jacob's horse was exhausted, steam rising from its heaving flanks, but they'd made good time despite the conditions. Now came the more dangerous part of his mission, entering a town where Boone might have allies seeking help without exposing Hannah's location. As he rode down Laramie's main street, Jacob kept his hat pulled low and his collar high. The town had grown since his last visit 2 years ago. New storefronts, a larger saloon, even a proper church with a small steeple. Signs of the railroad's imminent arrival were everywhere: surveyors' offices, land speculators, Eastern goods in shop windows. He located Dr. Clement's office, a modest clapboard building with fading gold letters on the sign, and tied his horse at the post outside. His legs nearly buckled as he dismounted Steph from cold and 20 hours in the saddle. Jacob pounded on the door, desperation making his knock heavier than intended. No answer came. He knocked again, harder. Finally, the door creaked open a crack. A man in his 60s peered out, thin and balding, with eyes like cold water. You bleeding? The doctor asked bluntly. No. Then you can wait. The door began to close. Jacob shoved his boot into the gap, preventing the closure. I don't have time to wait. The doctor's eyes narrowed at this breach of etiquette. Remove your foot, sir, or I'll... Jacob pulled Hannah's note from his pocket and thrust it toward the man. She said you'd remember her. Something flickered across Clement's face, surprise perhaps, or suspicion. He took the paper and unfolded it, reading quickly. His expression changed, not softening exactly, but sharpening with sudden intensity. Hannah Grace, he said. She's alive. Jacob nodded. Barely. Her infant has lung fever. Bad. The baby, it's Jeremiah's. Yes. Clement opened the door fully, allowing Jacob to enter. The office was small but meticulously organized with shelves of bottles and instruments lining the walls. "How long has the child been ill?" the doctor asked, already moving to gather supplies. 3, 4 days. Worsened last night. Breathing's labored. Blue around the lips." Clement nodded grimly. "Pneumonia. Infants rarely survive it without proper care." He fixed Jacob with a penetrating stare. "Why are you helping them? Who are you to Hannah?" "Nobody," Jacob replied honestly. "They came to my door in the storm." The doctor continued to study him, clearly finding this explanation insufficient. "Yet you rode 30 miles through snow to fetch medicine for a stranger's child." Jacob had no answer that would satisfy the man or himself for that matter. He remained silent. Clement seemed to reach a decision. "The child needs more than medicine. She needs proper care." He began packing his medical bag. "I'm coming with you." "Boone's men are watching for her," Jacob warned. "It's not safe." "I've treated gunshot wounds in 3 territories during the war," Clement replied dryly. "I think I can manage one angry foreman." He closed his bag with a snap. "Besides, Hannah is my responsibility." Jacob raised an eyebrow at this. "Her sister married my brother," Clement explained. "When Camilla died last year, I promised to look after Hannah. Then Jeremiah passed, and she stopped answering my letters." His mouth tightened. "Boone told everyone she'd run off with another man, abandoned the children. I feared the worst." "Boone lied," Jacob said flatly. "He's been hunting them since they fled. Killed their housekeeper. Threatened the children." Clement's face hardened. "That doesn't surprise me. The man's had a reputation for cruelty since he arrived in the valley." He hesitated, then added, "He's not working alone. Judge Norton from the territorial court has been supporting his land claims. They're systematically driving out smaller ranchers, particularly those without clear titles. Jeremiah's ranch. Prime land, water rights, and now with the railroad coming." Clement shook his head. "It could be worth a fortune. And Hannah has the deeds. If she has Jeremiah's papers signed and sealed, then yes, she's the legal owner, regardless of what Boone and Norton claim." Clement finished gathering his supplies, "which is precisely why they'll never stop hunting her." The implications settled heavily on Jacob's shoulders. This wasn't a situation that would resolve itself with one confrontation. Even if they survived Boone's immediate threat, Hannah and the children would never be safe as long as powerful men coveted what was legally hers. "We need to leave now," Jacob said, pushing aside these longer-term concerns. "Every hour matters for the child." Clement nodded. "I have a mule cart, slower than your horse but better suited to carrying his supplies through snow." He pulled on his coat. "And Jacob." "Yes. When we reach your cabin, I want the full story. Not just about Hannah, but about you." The doctor's eyes were sharp with intelligence. "I saw a Bible by your bed when you came in. Worn edges, pages, dog-eared in places. Not many men in these parts read scripture so thoroughly." Jacob stiffened, but gave a curt nod. Everyone had pasts they'd rather not discuss. His was no exception. But if Clement was willing to risk his life to save Mary, he deserved some measure of truth in return. As they prepared to depart, Jacob checked the street carefully for watchers. Nothing seemed amiss, but the hair on the back of his neck prickled with unease. Laramie was too quiet, the few people on the snow-covered street too studiously uninterested in the doctor's preparations. They were being watched. Jacob was certain of it, which meant Boone already knew he'd come to town and might have guessed his purpose. The race back to the cabin had become even more urgent, not just for medicine now, but to warn Hannah that their sanctuary was compromised. As Jacob mounted his horse and Clement climbed onto his mule cart, a distant figure caught Jacob's attention, a man on horseback at the edge of town watching them. Though too far to identify with certainty something in the rider's posture, the military straightness of his back sent a chill through Jacob that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Boone knew, and he was letting them leave, which could only mean one thing: he wanted them to lead him straight to Hannah. Jacob and Dr. Clement pushed their animals as hard as they dared through the gathering dusk. The temperature dropped rapidly as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains, turning breath to vapor and frosting beards with ice. Neither man spoke much, conserving energy and focus for the treacherous trail ahead. Jacob's mind raced despite his exhaustion. The mysterious rider at the edge of Laramie troubled him deeply. If it was indeed Boone, why hadn't he intercepted them? The answer seemed obvious. Boone wanted them to lead him straight to Hannah and the children, which meant they were potentially leading danger right to the cabin's door. "We need to watch for followers," Jacob finally said as they paused to rest the animals at a frozen creek crossing. Clement nodded, his weathered face grim in the fading light. "You think Boone's men are trailing us?" "Almost certain of it," Jacob replied, scanning the darkening landscape behind them. "Question is, how far back? And how many?" Clement added quietly. They pressed on through deepening darkness, guided only by starlight, reflected off the snow, and Jacob's intimate knowledge of the terrain. Every hour, Jacob would stop and listen, straining to detect any sound of pursuit. Each time he heard nothing but the whisper of wind through pine branches and the labored breathing of their mounts. The silence was almost more unnerving than confirmation of followers would have been. By midnight, both men were stiff with cold, and their animals were showing dangerous signs of fatigue. Jacob reluctantly called a halt in a sheltered draw where wind-twisted pines provided some protection from the bitter night air. 2 hours, he said as they dismounted. No fire. Clement didn't argue, though his face was pale with cold. The doctor immediately checked his medical supplies, ensuring the glass vials hadn't frozen or cracked during the journey. "Will we reach them by morning?" he asked, voice low. "Just after dawn, if we push hard," Jacob replied, chafing his hands together to restore circulation. "The baby victim," Mary, Clement corrected gently. "Mary," Jacob acknowledged. "How long can she last without treatment?" The doctor's expression grew somber. "Infants with severe pneumonia can decline very rapidly. Hours, not days." He hesitated. "The Elkshorn route your trapper friend provided might have bought some time if Hannah knew how to prepare it properly." Jacob nodded, hoping Hannah had found Sam's package in his saddlebags and understood its purpose. The alternative was too painful to contemplate arriving with medicine, only to find they were too late. As they huddled in silence beneath the pines, Clement studied Jacob with the same analytical gaze he might direct at a patient. "You were a minister," he said finally. It wasn't a question. Jacob stiffened. "Long time ago. Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist," Jacob replied reluctantly. "Small congregation in Pennsylvania. Before the war." Clement nodded as if confirming the diagnosis. "What happened?" Jacob stared out into the darkness. "War happened. Then life." The doctor waited, clearly expecting more, but Jacob offered nothing further. After a moment, Clement sighed. "I've known many men of faith who lost their way," he said. "War has a way of challenging even the strongest convictions." "It wasn't the war," Jacob said abruptly, surprising himself with the admission. "It was after, when I came home to find God had taken my wife and daughter while I was away fighting his battles." The bitterness in his voice hung in the cold air between them. "I'm sorry," Clement said quietly. "Don't be," Jacob replied. "It was a long time ago." "Not so long that you've forgotten," the doctor observed. "Or forgiven." Jacob turned to look at him directly. "You a religious man, doctor?" "I've seen too much suffering to believe in an all-loving God," Clement admitted, "but too many miracles to believe in none at all." The honest answer earned a grudging nod from Jacob. They lapsed into silence again, each man lost in his own thoughts as the stars wheeled overhead and the temperature continued to plummet. After their brief rest, they resumed their journey. The night seemed endless, the cold penetrating deeper with each passing hour. Jacob's wounded leg ached fiercely, an old memento from Gettysburg that flared in extreme cold. Still, he pushed on, driven by an urgency he hadn't felt in years. Dawn found them only 5 miles from the cabin, the familiar contours of Blackwater Ridge, silhouetted against the lightning eastern sky. As visibility improved, Jacob scrutinized their back trail more carefully. Still no visible pursuit, which only deepened his unease. Boone was too experienced a tracker to have lost them in open country. "Something's wrong," he muttered. Clement glanced at him. "What do you mean in no pursuit? Boone should be on our trail by now." The doctor frowned. "Perhaps he wasn't in Laramie after all. Perhaps the rider you saw was someone else." Jacob shook his head. "No, he was there." A chilling thought struck him. Unless what? "Unless he's not following us because he's already ahead of us," Jacob said grimly, spurring his exhausted horse to a faster pace. They crested the final ridge an hour later, and Jacob's heart sank. Even from a distance, he could see fresh tracks in the snow surrounding the cabin, multiple sets of boot prints circling the structure, then leading away toward the east. No smoke rose from the chimney. "Stay here," Jacob ordered Clement, drawing his rifle. "If there's danger, then one of us needs to survive to help the children." Jacob cut him off. "You have the medicine. I'll signal if it's safe." Without waiting for a response, Jacob urged his horse down the slope, approaching the cabin with caution. The tracks in the snow told a story. At least 5 men had surrounded the cabin, then departed together. The boot prints were crisp, no more than a few hours old. Jacob dismounted 50 yards out, continuing on foot with his rifle ready. Wolf's body still lay where he'd fallen now, frozen solid and partially covered by fresh snow. No other signs of violence were immediately visible. He reached the cabin door and found it still bolted from inside, a good sign. Jacob knocked in the pattern he had arranged with Hannah. 3 rapid taps, paused 2 more. "Hannah, it's Jacob. Open up." Silence greeted him. He knocked again, louder. "Hannah Asa, it's safe to come out." Still nothing. Fear clawing at his gut, Jacob stepped back and slammed his shoulder against the door. The wood groaned but held. He tried again, putting his full weight behind the impact. This time the bolt splintered and the door swung inward. The cabin was empty. The fire had burned down to cold ashes. Blankets lay scattered on the floor. A bowl of congealed soup sat on the table, evidence of a meal interrupted. But of Hannah and the children there was no sign. Jacob checked the root cellar, also empty. He searched the cabin methodically, looking for any clue to what had happened. Had Boone found them? Had they fled? If they'd been taken by force, surely there would be signs of struggle. Blood. Then he spotted it, a small wooden carving on the mantel. A bird roughly shaped from pine that he'd whittled for Ruthie 2 nights ago. Beside it lay a folded scrap of paper. Jacob opened it with trembling fingers. "Jacob Mary Worse. Riders came. Hiding in the old church. Bring medicine quickly." Hannah relief flooded through him, followed immediately by fresh concern. The old church could only mean one place: his father's abandoned chapel in the hills 5 miles southwest. A place Jacob hadn't visited in nearly a decade, since burying the old man beside its weathered walls. He stepped outside and signaled Clement to approach. As the doctor drove his mule cart into the yard, Jacob quickly explained the situation. "They've gone to ground in a place about 5 miles from here. An old church my father built." He helped Clement gather his medical supplies. "We need to hurry. If Mary's condition worsened enough that they risk moving her..." Clement nodded grimly, retrieving a black leather case from his cart. "Lead the way." They set off immediately, Jacob setting a brisk pace despite his exhaustion and the doctor's difficulty in keeping up. The trail to the church was less traveled, winding through dense pine forests and along rocky ridgelines where the wind had scoured away much of the snow. "Your father was a minister too?" Clement asked as they navigated a particularly treacherous slope. Jacob nodded. "Built the chapel himself after my mother died. Said he needed a place where heaven felt closer." His mouth twisted in a humorless smile. "Spent his last years there alone, preaching to empty pews every Sunday." "You didn't visit him?" "Not often enough," Jacob admitted. "After Sarah and Emma died, I couldn't bear his certainty, his insistence that it was all part of God's plan." Clement was silent for a moment. "And now, what do you believe now?" Jacob didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "I believe in what I can see," he said finally. "What I can touch. The rest..." He shook his head. "The rest is just words." They crested a final ridge and the church came into view in the valley below. It was a simple structure, rough-hewn logs forming a rectangular building with a small steeple that listed slightly to one side. A crude cross fashioned from 2 pine branches, lashed together, still crowned the peak. No smoke rose from the chimney here either, and no movement was visible around the building. Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Something's wrong," he murmured. They approached cautiously, Jacob's rifle at the ready. As they drew closer, he could see that the main door stood slightly ajar, not a good sign. Hannah would have secured it if she could. "Wait here," he instructed Clement again, but the doctor shook his head. "If someone's injured, you'll need me," he insisted, gripping his medical bag tightly. Jacob couldn't argue with the logic. Together they approached the church, moving as silently as possible through the crusted snow. At the door, Jacob paused, listening. From inside came the faintest sound, a child's whimper, quickly hushed. He pushed the door open slowly, rifle raised. The interior was dim, lit only by what little sunlight filtered through the damaged roof and a single intact window. Dust motes danced in the pale beams. The pews were long gone, burned for firewood, or rotted away. All that remained was the stone altar at the far end, and beside it, Jacob, Hannah's voice weak with relief. She emerged from the shadows behind the altar, Mary clutched to her chest. Asa appeared beside her, a small revolver Jacob's Whitney gripped in his hand. Ruthie peeked out from behind her brother, eyes wide with fear. "It's me," Jacob confirmed, lowering his rifle. "I brought the doctor." Hannah's face crumpled with emotion. She swayed slightly, and Jacob crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "The baby?" he asked urgently. "Alive," Hannah whispered, "but barely. She stopped breathing twice in the night. I thought—" Her voice broke. Clement was already opening his bag, his professional demeanor taking over. "Let me see her," he said gently, guiding Hannah to sit on a broken pew near the only window where the light was better. As the doctor examined the infant, Jacob turned to Asa. "What happened at the cabin? Why did you leave?" The boy's face was pale but composed. Men came, 5 of them. They surrounded the cabin just after sunset. "Did they try to get in?" Asa shook his head. "They just watched. For hours. Then one of them, the leader, he called out. Said they knew you'd gone for the doctor. Said you wouldn't make it back." The boy swallowed hard. "He said they'd burn us out at dawn if we didn't come out." "Boone?" Jacob asked, though he already knew the answer. "No," Asa replied. "Someone else. Younger. He knew you, though. Called you preacher." Jacob frowned. One of Boone's recruits, perhaps someone from the old riders who remembered Jacob. "Mama decided we should slip out the back while they were still watching the front," Asa continued. "She remembered you mentioning your father's church. Said it might be safer than Mitchell's cabin since the trapper is known in town." Jacob nodded, impressed with Hannah's quick thinking. "You did well," he told the boy. "Both of you." Ruthie had crept closer during their conversation, her small hand slipping into Jacob's larger one. The gesture, so natural and trusting, caught him off guard. He looked down at the child's face, saw fear there, but also complete confidence that he would make things right. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at Jacob Harrow that way. Across the church, Clement was administering medicine to Mary, his movements efficient and practiced. Hannah watched with desperate hope as the doctor placed drops of liquid under the infant's tongue, then wrapped her more securely in clean bandages he'd brought. "Will she—" Hannah couldn't finish the question. "The fever's very high," Clement said honestly, "but she's strong, fighting hard." He prepared another dose of medicine. "I've seen children recover from worse." Hannah closed her eyes briefly, a silent prayer passing her lips. Jacob moved to secure the church, checking the few remaining windows and the back door. The building was in worse shape than he remembered, roof damaged in several places, walls gapped where chinking had fallen away, floorboards rotted through in spots. Still, it offered shelter and, more importantly, visibility. Anyone approaching would be seen long before they reached the doors. As he completed his inspection, Jacob found himself before the stone altar. His father had hauled the massive slab up from the riverbed himself, insisting that a proper church needed a proper altar, no matter how humble the rest of the structure might be. The old man's Bible still lay upon it, pages swollen with moisture, binding cracked with age. Jacob didn't touch it. Some ghosts were better left undisturbed. He returned to the others to find Mary resting more comfortably, her breathing less labored. Clement was checking Hannah now, noting the bruises on her wrists and the exhaustion evident in her face. "You need rest," the doctor said firmly. "All of you do. The medicine will help Mary, but her recovery will take time." "We don't have time," Jacob interjected. "Boone knows we're in the area. If his men have been watching the cabin, they'll widen their search when they find it empty." Clement frowned. "The child cannot be moved again so soon. The journey here nearly killed her." "Then we make our stand here," Jacob said grimly. Hannah looked up at him, her face drawn with fatigue, but her eyes clear. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You could walk away. This isn't your fight." Jacob met her gaze. The question deserved an honest answer if he could find one. Why was he risking his life for this woman and her children? Was it simply because they had appeared at his door? Or was it something more, some need for redemption, for purpose beyond mere survival? "I've walked away before," he said finally. "Didn't much care for the man it made me." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was the most honest one he could offer. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding beyond words. Hannah nodded slightly, accepting his response without pressing further. The rest of the day was spent preparing. Jacob showed Asa how to reinforce the doors, how to create firing positions at the windows. Clement tended to Mary, whose condition stabilized enough to allow cautious hope. Ruthie helped where she could, gathering fallen wood for a small fire in what remained of the old stone hearth. As evening approached, Jacob stood at the single intact window, watching the sun sink toward the western mountains. The sky had taken on a peculiar amber hue, the kind old-timers claimed presaged a change in weather. Sure enough, clouds were building on the northern horizon, dark and heavy with promise. "Storm coming," he murmured. Hannah joined him at the window, Mary sleeping in her arms. "How long do we have?" "Before the storm hours, maybe less." Jacob's eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "Before Boone finds us, hard to say. Depends on how well his men know these hills. And if he does find us," Hannah's voice was steady, but Jacob could sense the fear beneath her composure. "Then we fight," he said simply. "Or we run if we can. Church has a cellar, my father stored supplies there. Might be a way out through the old drainage tunnel." Hannah studied his profile, the fading light casting deep shadows across the planes of his face. "You've changed since we met," she observed. Jacob glanced at her. "How so?" "Oh, 2 days ago you wanted nothing to do with us, wanted us gone as soon as possible." A faint smile touched her lips. "Now you're planning escape routes and talking about making a stand." Jacob returned his gaze to the window. "2 days ago I was a different man." "What changed?" He considered the question carefully. "Maybe nothing," he admitted. "Maybe this is who I've always been beneath the bitterness." Hannah shifted Mary to her other arm, the baby stirring slightly but not waking. "My husband used to say that crisis reveals character, it doesn't create it." "Sounds like a wise man." "He was," Hannah said softly. "Not perfect, but good, kind." She hesitated. "He would have liked you, I think." Jacob wasn't sure how to respond to that. He was saved from having to try when Asa called from the back of the church. "Someone's coming." Jacob moved swiftly to where the boy stood by a gap in the wall. Following Asa's pointing finger, he saw a lone figure approaching on foot from the east, a man moving slowly but deliberately through the gathering dusk. "Stay inside," Jacob ordered, grabbing his rifle. "Bar the door behind me." He slipped out the front entrance before Hannah could protest, circling around to approach the stranger from an angle that kept the church between them. As he drew closer, Jacob realized the man was older, black, wearing a battered hat and carrying a worn leather satchel. Not one of Boone's men unless he'd started recruiting far outside his usual circles. "That's far enough," Jacob called when the man was about 30 yards out. He raised his rifle to emphasize the point. The stranger stopped, raising empty hands to show he carried no weapon. "Peace, brother," he called back, his voice deep and resonant despite his age. "I mean no harm." "What's your business here?" Jacob demanded, not lowering the rifle. "Heard tell there might be folks in need at the old church," the man replied calmly. "Came to offer what help I can." Jacob's suspicion deepened. "Who told you that?" "The Lord works in mysterious ways," the old man said with a slight smile. "But if you're asking for earthly sources, it was Sam Blackwood who mentioned you might be headed this way with a doctor and a sick child." Jacob cursed silently. Sam was no traitor, but the old trapper talked too freely when whiskey loosened his tongue. If he'd mentioned Jacob's destination in Laramie— "What's your name?" Jacob asked, still wary. "Moses Johnson," the man replied. "Reverend Moses Johnson, though I haven't had a proper congregation in some years." "You're a preacher." Jacob couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. "I am," Moses confirmed. "Was circuit riding through these parts when my mule went lame 3 days back. Been waiting in Laramie for her to heal." He gestured toward the church. "When I heard this old place might be occupied again, well," he smiled. "Seemed like a sign." Jacob studied the man carefully. Everything about him appeared genuine, the weathered face that had seen hard years, the gentle eyes that held both sorrow and warmth, the hands calloused from work as well as prayer. Still, caution was necessary. "Wait here," Jacob said, backing toward the church. "I'll need to consult the others." Inside, he found Hannah, Clement, and the children gathered anxiously near the door. "There's a preacher out there," Jacob explained. "Says Sam Blackwood told him we might be here." "A preacher?" Hannah repeated, clearly confused. "Why would a preacher come all this way?" "Claims he was in Laramie when he heard about us." Jacob shook his head. Could be genuine. Could be one of Boone's men in disguise. What's your instinct? Clement asked. Jacob hesitated. He seems authentic, but I've been wrong before. Hannah adjusted Mary in her arms, the infant now awake and fussing softly. We could use another pair of hands, she said quietly, and if he is a man of good. Jacob understood her unspoken thought. If the worst happened, if Mary's condition deteriorated again, a preacher might provide comfort of a kind that Jacob with his abandoned faith could not. I'll bring him in, Jacob decided, but we watch him carefully. Asa, keep the Whitney ready just in case. The boy nodded solemnly, checking that the small revolver was loaded. Jacob returned outside to find Moses Johnson exactly where he'd left him, waiting patiently in the falling darkness. You can come in, Jacob said, still keeping his rifle ready. But I'll take any weapons first. Only weapon I carry is the word, Moses replied, but he submitted to being searched without protest. Jacob found no hidden guns or knives, only a small Bible in the man's coat pocket, and various supplies in his satchel, dried herbs, bandages, a flask of what smelled like medicinal whiskey. Satisfied, Moses asked when the inspection was complete. Jacob nodded curtly and led the way back to the church. As they entered, he noticed Moses pause, looking around the dilapidated interior with an expression of thoughtful assessment rather than dismay. Good bones, the preacher murmured, still standing after all these years. Hannah stepped forward, Mary in her arms. You're welcome, Reverend, if you truly come to help. Moses bowed slightly. I do, ma'am. And please, just Moses will do. I find titles get in the way of honest work. Introductions were made, with Jacob noting that Hannah used only first names, offering no details about their situation. Wise precaution, though. If Moses had spoken with Sam, he likely already knew more than was comfortable. The preacher's attention immediately went to Mary. May I? He asked Hannah gently. After a moment's hesitation, she allowed Moses to examine the infant. His large hands were surprisingly gentle as he felt Mary's forehead and listened to her breathing. Lungwort tea would help, he said, reaching into his satchel. I have some dried, been using it for pneumonia cases since the war. Clement raised an eyebrow. You have medical training, field experience, Moses replied. Served with the 54th Massachusetts. Ended up tending wounded when our surgeons were overwhelmed. He extracted a small pouch of dried herbs. Learned most of my healing from an old freedwoman in Georgia. Saved more lives with her remedies than the Army doctors did with their saws. The mention of the 54th, one of the first black regiments in the Union Army, famous for its assault on Fort Wagner, lent credibility to Moses' story. Jacob relaxed slightly, though he remained watchful. As Moses helped Clement prepare the herbal tea, Jacob pulled Hannah aside. What do you think? He asked quietly. I think he's genuine, she replied. The way he handles Mary. He knows children. She glanced toward the preacher. And there's something in his eyes. A kindness, but also a deep sorrow. The kind that comes from losing much. Jacob had noticed it too, the weight Moses carried visible in the set of his shoulders and the lines etched around his eyes. It was a familiar burden, one Jacob recognized from his own reflection. Their whispered conversation was interrupted by a sound that made everyone freeze, hoofbeats, distant but approaching. Jacob moved swiftly to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. Through the swirling snow that had begun to fall, he could make out riders coming down the ridge, at least 5 of them moving with purpose. Boone, he said grimly, turning back to the others. They've found us. Everyone away from the windows, Jacob ordered, grabbing his rifle. Clement, get Hannah and the children to the cellar. The doctor didn't argue, already gathering his medical supplies. This way, he directed Hannah, who clutched Mary tightly to her chest. What about you? Hannah asked Jacob, her eyes wide with fear but her voice steady. I'll hold them off, Jacob replied, checking his ammunition. Buy you time to escape through the drainage tunnel if necessary. I'm staying, Asa declared, the Whitney revolver gripped firmly in his small hand. Jacob started to protest, but the determined set of the boy's jaw stopped him. At 10 years old, Asa had already witnessed more violence than most grown men. Denying him the chance to defend his family would only compound the injustice he'd already suffered. Stay low, Jacob instructed instead. Only shoot if they get inside. Moses stepped forward. I'll help, he said simply, rolling up his sleeves. Jacob glanced at the preacher skeptically. You ever fired a gun, Reverend? Carried a Spencer carbine at Fort Wagner? Moses replied evenly. And I've seen enough killing to know when it's necessary. He met Jacob's eyes. I don't seek violence, but I won't stand aside while children are threatened. Jacob handed him the Colt revolver from his belt. 6 shots. Make them count. As Clement led Hannah, Ruthie, and Mary to the cellar beneath the altar, Jacob positioned himself at the window. The riders had stopped about 100 yards from the church, gathering in a loose semicircle just beyond effective rifle range. In the fading light, Jacob couldn't make out individual faces, but he recognized Boone's military bearing, even at this distance. They're waiting for full dark, Jacob muttered. Moses took position at a gap in the wall, the revolver held comfortably in his weathered hand. How many, Tom? At least 5 that I can see, Jacob replied. Could be more circling around back. Asa had positioned himself near the rear door, small and silent as a shadow. I'll watch the back, he whispered. Outside, snow began to fall more heavily, the wind driving it in swirling patterns that further reduced visibility. The temperature was dropping rapidly as night settled in. Under different circumstances, the weather might have deterred an attack. But Jacob knew Boone would view the storm as an advantage cover for his approach and an obstacle to any escape. What's Boone's play here? Jacob wondered aloud. He must know we're armed, that we'll fight back. Men like that don't expect resistance, Moses replied. They're used to people folding at the first show of force. Boone's smarter than that, Jacob disagreed. He was a good soldier once, knows tactics. Pride changes a man, Moses said quietly, makes him overestimate his own strength, underestimate others. Before Jacob could respond, a voice called out from the darkness, carrying clearly despite the rising wind. Harrow, I know you're in there. Boone's voice unmistakable in its commanding tone. Send out the woman and the papers, and the rest of you can ride out, Boone continued. No need for bloodshed. Jacob remained silent, calculating distances and angles. From their position, Boone's men would have to cross open ground to reach the church, difficult in the best conditions, potentially suicidal under fire. I'm counting to 10, preacher, Boone called again. Then we're coming in hard. Still, Jacob held his fire. Let them come closer. Let the darkness and snow confuse their approach. The count never reached 10. Instead, a muzzle flash lit the night, and a bullet splintered the window frame inches from Jacob's head. He ducked instinctively as more shots followed, peppering the church's weathered walls. They're trying to pin us down, Jacob called to Moses. Watch for movement on the flanks. The initial volley died away, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the wind. Jacob peered cautiously through the damaged window, struggling to see through the thickening snowfall. Shadows moved in the darkness, men advancing in a scattered line, using the weather as cover. Jacob took careful aim and fired. A cry of pain answered, followed by more gunshots from Boone's men. The church's walls solid as they were offered imperfect protection. Bullets punched through gaps in the chinking, sending splinters flying. From his position at the rear, Asa suddenly called out, "They're at the back door." Jacob turned just as the door burst inward, a bearded man in a heavy coat lunging through with a revolver raised. Before Jacob could swing his rifle around, Asa fired. The Whitney's report was deafening in the confined space. The intruder staggered, clutching his leg where the boy's bullet had struck. He fell heavily to his knees, his gun clattering to the floor. Moses moved swiftly, disarming the wounded man and securing the damaged door as best he could. "Good shot, boy," the preacher said to Asa, whose face was pale but determined. Outside, the attack intensified. Bullets tore through the walls and remaining windows. Jacob returned fire steadily, conserving ammunition, taking careful aim with each shot. Twice he was rewarded with cries of pain from the darkness. From the cellar below, Ruthie's frightened whimpers could be heard during lulls in the gunfire. Hannah's voice responded soothing and steady, despite the chaos above. "We can't hold them off forever," Moses said, taking position at another window. "How many rounds do you have left?" "Not enough," Jacob admitted grimly. A new sound caught their attention, the crack and hiss of flames. Through the window, Jacob saw a burning torch arc through the air, landing on the church's roof. Within seconds, another followed, and another. "They're trying to burn us out," Moses observed, his voice remarkably calm. Jacob glanced up at the damaged roof, already imagining how quickly the dry, aged timber would catch. "We need to move," he decided. "Get everyone through the cellar tunnel." "What tunnel?" Moses asked. "My father built a drainage passage from the cellar to the creek bed," Jacob explained, firing another shot through the window to discourage advancement. It's narrow but passable, leads out about 200 yards downhill. A section of the roof burst into flames, casting flickering orange light throughout the church's interior. Smoke began to filter down, acrid and thick. "Go help them," Jacob ordered Moses. "I'll cover your retreat." The preacher hesitated. "You can't hold off that many men alone." "I don't intend to," Jacob replied. "Just long enough for you to get clear." Understanding dawned in Moses' eyes. "You're planning to surrender yourself, draw their attention while we escape." Jacob didn't deny it. "Boone wants me as much as he wants Hannah. Old scores to settle." "That's suicide," Moses said flatly. "Maybe," Jacob admitted, "but 5 lives against 1 is simple arithmetic, Reverend." A thunderous crash interrupted their conversation as a burning section of roof collapsed near the altar. Heat and smoke intensified. Outside, Boone's men had ceased firing, apparently content to let the fire do their work. "Go," Jacob insisted. "Get them out now." Moses clasped Jacob's shoulder briefly, then hurried to the cellar entrance. Jacob maintained his position at the window, watching for any attempt to surround the building. The snowfall had increased to a near blizzard wind, howling around the church's corners and driving the flames higher despite the moisture. Through the smoke and falling debris, Jacob heard activity from the cellar. Hannah's voice, Ruthie's frightened cries, Clement's calm instructions. Then Moses reappeared, his face grim. "There's a problem," the preacher reported. "The tunnel entrance has collapsed. Must have happened years ago." Jacob's heart sank. "How bad?" "Complete blockage. Would take hours to clear even with proper tools." Another section of roof gave way, sending burning timbers crashing to the floor. The heat was becoming unbearable, smoke thickening by the second. "We need another way out," Jacob said, mind racing. "The back wall, it's the weakest point. If we could create a diversion at the front." Before he could complete the thought, Hannah emerged from the cellar, Mary clutched protectively against her chest. Clement followed with Ruthie. All were coughing from the smoke. "The fire's spreading too quickly," Clement reported. "We can't stay down there." Jacob made a swift decision. "Everyone to the back wall, stay low below the smoke." As they moved toward the rear of the church, a shout came from outside. "Harrow, come out now or burn with the rest of them." Boone's voice closer now, near the front entrance. Jacob turned to Hannah, his face illuminated by the hellish orange glow of the spreading fire. "Give me the land papers," he said urgently. "What? Why?" Hannah clutched Mary tighter, confused by the request. "Boone wants 2 things, you and those papers. I'm going to give him one to save the other." Understanding dawned in Hannah's eyes. "No," she said firmly. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself." "This isn't a debate," Jacob replied, his voice gentle but unyielding. "The papers. Now." After a moment's hesitation, Hannah reluctantly reached into her bodice and withdrew a folded packet of documents wrapped in oilcloth. "These won't save your life," she warned as she handed them over. "They might buy enough time for all of you to escape," Jacob countered. He turned to Moses. "When I go out front, take them through the back. Head for the creek, then follow it west. There's a cave in the bluffs about a mile downstream. You'll be sheltered from the storm there." Moses nodded solemnly. "We'll pray for you, brother." "Save your breath," Jacob replied without rancor. "You'll need it in this cold." He moved toward the front of the church, but Hannah caught his arm. Her face smudged with soot and illuminated by flames held an expression Jacob couldn't immediately identify. Fear certainly, but also something deeper, more complex. "Why?" she asked simply. Jacob didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Because you deserve a chance," he said. "All of you. And you don't—" He had no answer for that. Hannah's grip on his arm tightened. "Come back to us," she whispered. "Promise me." "I'm not one for promises," Jacob said softly. "Not anymore." Before she could respond, he gently disengaged from her grasp and moved toward the burning front of the church. The heat was nearly unbearable now, flames licking along the remaining roof beams, smoke billowing in thick clouds. Jacob paused at the door, checking his rifle empty and his revolver, 2 shots remaining. Not enough to fight his way out, but perhaps enough for what he had in mind. "Ready," he called back to Moses. The preacher nodded, gathering the others near the back wall, where Asa and Clement were already working to pry loose a section of damaged planking. Jacob took a deep breath, then pushed open the church door. The rush of cold air momentarily cleared the smoke, giving him a clear view of the scene outside. Boone stood about 20 yards away, flanked by 3 men with rifles trained on the entrance. Behind them, two more men held torches ready to throw them if needed. All were partially sheltered behind the remnants of an old stone wall that had once enclosed the churchyard. Harrow, Boone called a note of surprise in his voice. Perhaps he hadn't expected surrender, or perhaps he hadn't expected Jacob to survive this long. Jacob stepped forward, hands raised, the packet of papers visible in his right hand. "I'm coming out," he called. "No tricks." "Drop the gun," Boone ordered. Jacob carefully set his revolver on the ground, keeping the papers prominently displayed. "I have what you want, Boone," he said, his voice carrying despite the wind. "The land deeds. Hannah's legal claim to Echo Valley." Even through the swirling snow, Jacob could see Boone's posture change, the slight straightening of his spine, the predatory tilt of his head, like a wolf scenting blood. "Bring them here," Boone commanded. Jacob took another step forward, then stopped. "Let the others go first," he countered. "The doctor, the children. They're not part of this." Boone laughed, the sound harsh in the winter night. "You're not in a position to negotiate, preacher." "These papers are," Jacob replied, holding them higher, "one spark from that burning church, and Echo Valley belongs to the territorial government." "Is that what you want, to start the legal process all over again, with Judge Norton's involvement becoming public record?" A momentary hesitation from Boone told Jacob his shot in the dark had struck home. The connection between Boone and the judge was real and potentially damaging if exposed. "The others go free," Jacob pressed. "Then you get the papers." Boone considered for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "Fine, they can go. But the woman stays." "All of them," Jacob insisted, "or we can all burn together, papers included." As they negotiated, Jacob was acutely aware of the time-passing precious seconds that Moses needed to get the others out through the back of the church. Boone finally growled his assent. "Right. Tell them to come out, slowly, where we can see them." Jacob turned slightly toward the church. "Dr. Clement," he called, praying the others were already gone. "Bring the children out. It's safe." No response came from the burning building. Jacob silently blessed Moses for understanding his plan. "They're already gone, aren't they?" Boone realized, his voice hardening. "This is a distraction." Jacob turned back to face him fully. "Not entirely," he said, holding up the papers again. "These are real enough." Boone gestured sharply to his men, who immediately began spreading out, moving to flank the church. "Find them," he ordered. Jacob knew he had only seconds before they discovered the escape route. He took a calculated risk, closing half the distance to Boone in a few quick strides. "You want these?" he challenged, holding the papers toward the flames still emanating from his coat, which had caught fire during his exit from the church. "Come get them." Boone's eyes narrowed. "Kill him," he commanded. The men raised their rifles, but Jacob had anticipated the order. He dropped to the ground as shots rang out, the bullets passing harmlessly overhead. In the same motion, he snatched up his discarded revolver and fired his remaining 2 shots in quick succession. The first struck one of Boone's men in the chest, dropping him instantly. The second missed Boone himself by inches, splintering the fence post beside him. Then Jacob was running not away from Boone, but toward him, closing the distance before the remaining men could reload. He crashed into Boone with the force of desperation, driving them both into the snow. They grappled violently, Boone's greater size matched against Jacob's determined fury. Fists connected with flesh boots kicked for purchase in the snow. The land papers scattered, forgotten in the life-or-death struggle. "Should have stayed out of it, preacher," Boone grunted, landing a powerful blow to Jacob's ribs that drove the air from his lungs. Jacob responded with an elbow to Boone's jaw that rocked the bigger man back. "Like I stayed out when you hanged Miguel Rodriguez," he gasped. "An innocent man, Boone. You knew it then, you know it now." "Law of the territory," Boone replied, his voice cold as the surrounding snow. "Strong survive. Weak don't." "That's not law," Jacob countered, blocking another punch. "That's just cruelty dressed up as justice." Their struggle continued, neither man able to gain a decisive advantage. Behind them, the church burned furiously, despite the snow casting their shadows in grotesque, elongated shapes across the whitened ground. Boone's remaining men had disappeared in pursuit of the others, leaving the 2 former comrades in arms to settle their score alone. Boone finally gained the upper hand, pinning Jacob beneath him, hands closing around his throat. "You always were soft, Harrow," he snarled. "Too much God, not enough backbone." Jacob's vision began to darken as Boone's grip tightened. With his remaining strength, he reached up and jabbed his thumbs into Boone's eyes. The bigger man recoiled with a howl of pain, releasing his grip. Jacob rolled away, gasping for breath, fumbling in the snow for any weapon. His hand closed around a piece of broken wood from the church, a section of pew perhaps, or door frame. He swung it with all his strength, connecting solidly with Boone's temple. Boone collapsed momentarily, stunned. Jacob staggered to his feet, discarding the makeshift club. The landing papers lay scattered in the snow, already being covered by fresh flakes. He began gathering them, fingers numb with cold, desperate to secure them before Boone recovered. "I should have killed you years ago," Boone growled, pushing himself to his knees, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "After you betrayed the riders." "The riders betrayed themselves," Jacob replied, securing the last of the papers inside his coat. "Turned from justice to vengeance. Became no better than the outlaws they hunted." "We were bringing order to chaos," Boone insisted. "Building something that would last." "On a foundation of fear and blood," Jacob countered. "Nothing built on that stands for long." Boone lunged, suddenly tackling Jacob back to the ground. The impact drove them both toward the burning church heat, searing their skin as they rolled perilously close to the flames. "You want to burn, preacher?" Boone snarled, forcing Jacob's head toward the fire. "Like the sinners in your sermons." Jacob fought desperately, the heat blistering the side of his face. With a surge of strength born of pure survival instinct, he broke Boone's grip and scrambled away from the inferno. Boone followed, relentless in his pursuit. As they grappled again, a thunderous crack split the night. Both men looked up to see the church's steeple, swaying precariously, weakened by fire and ready to collapse. Jacob reacted instinctively, diving away from the danger. Boone, a fraction slower, had only begun to move when the burning structure came crashing down. A massive beam struck him squarely, driving him to the ground beneath a cascade of flaming debris. The impact shook the earth. Jacob, though clear of the main collapse, was showered with burning splinters and cinders. He rolled in the snow to extinguish his smoldering clothes, then looked back at the devastation. Boone lay half buried in the burning wreckage, pinned by the heavy beam. He was conscious, eyes wide with pain and fury, struggling futilely to free himself. "Help me, damn you," he gasped, reaching toward Jacob. Despite everything, Jacob hesitated. The man before him was a murderer, a tyrant who had threatened children and burned churches. Yet he was also a fellow soldier who had once saved Jacob's life at Gettysburg, pulling him to safety when Confederate fire had nearly claimed him. Such debts were not easily dismissed, even after years of enmity. Jacob approached cautiously, assessing the situation. The beam that trapped Boone was too heavy for one man to lift, especially in his exhausted state. More concerning, the fire was spreading rapidly through the debris, approaching Boone's pinned form with inexorable hunger. "If I try to move that beam, it could bring down more," Jacob said, meeting Boone's desperate gaze. "Then shoot me," Boone replied through gritted teeth. "Don't let me burn, Harrow, not like this." Jacob's hand moved to his belt, but his revolver was gone, lost in their struggle. He glanced around for Boone's weapon, but it too had disappeared in the snow. "I've got nothing to shoot you with," he admitted. Boone's laugh was a harsh, broken sound. "God's justice is that it, making me die by fire after I tried to burn you out." "This isn't justice," Jacob said quietly. "Just tragedy, like everything you've touched these past years." Despite the dire circumstances, he made one attempt to shift the beam, straining with all his remaining strength. It moved slightly, but not enough. The effort left him gasping, ribs protesting sharply where Boone had struck him earlier. "It's no use," Boone acknowledged, his voice strangely calm now. The fight seemed to be draining from him as the reality of his situation set in. "Get out of here, Harrow. No sense in both of us dying." Jacob hesitated, torn between ancient loyalty and the urgency of finding Hannah and the others before Boone's remaining men did. "What about your men?" he asked. "They'll be back when they see the steeples fallen." "Gone after the woman and kids," Boone replied, wincing as the heat intensified. "Told them to bring her back no matter what. Said I'd meet them at the East Ridge by dawn." The information decided Jacob. Hannah, the children, Moses, and Clement were in immediate danger. Whatever debt he owed Boone had been paid in his attempt to save him, futile though it was. "I'm sorry it came to this," Jacob said, meaning it despite everything. Boone's eyes met his, something like understanding passing between them. "We chose our paths long ago, preacher," he said. "Now go. Find them before my men do." Jacob nodded once, then turned away from the burning church and the man trapped within its collapsing remains. The snow had eased somewhat, though the wind remained bitter. He oriented himself quickly, then set off in the direction Moses would have led the others toward the creek, then west to the cave in the bluffs. He hadn't gone 50 yards when a gunshot rang out behind him. Jacob whirled, half expecting to see Boone somehow freed and armed. Instead, he glimpsed a figure silhouetted against the flames. One of Boone's men returned to check on his leader. The man stood over Boone's trapped form, a pistol in his hand, smoke curling from the barrel. A mercy-killing, Jacob realized. Boone's final escape from the encroaching flames. The man looked up, spotting Jacob in the darkness. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Then the man deliberately turned away, disappearing into the swirling snow in the opposite direction. Jacob stood frozen for a heartbeat, processing what had just occurred. Then survival instinct reasserted itself. He needed to move to find the others before the remaining men did. The land papers were secure inside his coat. Boone was dead. But the danger hadn't passed, not while armed men still hunted Hannah and the children through the winter night. Jacob set off at a stumbling run, following the barely visible tracks that led toward the creek. His left leg, with its old Gettysburg wound, protested sharply with each step. His lungs burned from smoke inhalation. Blood from a dozen minor injuries frozen in crusty patches on his skin. But he moved forward, driven by a purpose stronger than pain or exhaustion. For the first time in years, Jacob Harrow was fighting for something beyond mere survival, for people who needed him for a future that might hold more than solitude and bitter memories. The storm was his ally, now obscuring his tracks as he followed the faint trail left by Moses and the others. He moved as quickly as his injuries allowed, scanning constantly for any sign of pursuit. Twice he thought he heard voices carried on the wind, but they faded without materializing into tangible threat. After what felt like hours but was likely less than one, Jacob reached the creek. Its surface was partially frozen, dark water gurgling beneath a crust of ice. The tracks led along its bank as expected, heading west toward the bluffs that rose like shadowy sentinels in the distance. He followed, hope rising as the trail remained clear enough to track despite the falling snow. They had passed this way not long ago. He might catch them before they reached the cave, warn them about Boone's men, help protect them during the vulnerable journey. Then as he rounded a bend in the creek, Jacob froze. Ahead, clearly visible against the snow, lay a small figure, face down on the ground. Jacob's heart seized as he raced toward the prone figure. Relief flooded through him as he drew closer. Not a child, but a bundle of clothing dropped in haste. He recognized Ruthie's scarf, now half buried in snow. He snatched it up, searching for tracks. They continued westward, more hurried now, less careful. Signs of flight rather than careful retreat. Something had spooked them, forced them to move faster, despite the danger of leaving a clearer trail. Jacob quickened his pace, ignoring the protests of his battered body. The land papers crinkled against his chest with each labored breath, a reminder of what was at stake. The creek curved sharply ahead, disappearing into a narrow ravine, flanked by limestone bluffs. The cave he'd mentioned to Moses lay at the far end of that ravine, a natural shelter he'd discovered years ago while hunting. A gunshot echoed through the night, followed by another. The sounds came from the direction of the ravine. Jacob abandoned caution, breaking into a staggering run. His boots slipped on the icy creek bank, sending him crashing to his knees more than once. Still, he pushed forward, drawing his hunting knife, the only weapon he had left. As he entered the ravine, the wind's howl intensified, channeled between the rocky walls. Snow swirled in disorienting patterns, reducing visibility to mere yards. Jacob slowed, moving more cautiously now, alert for any movement. Another shot rang out closer this time, followed by a man's cry of pain. Not Moses, the voice was younger, harsher, one of Boone's men. Jacob crept forward until he could make out figures in the swirling snow. 3 men taking cover behind boulders, firing toward the cave entrance, about 40 yards ahead. From the cave, occasional return fire flashed, but it was sporadic, defensive. Moses and the others had reached the shelter, but they were pinned down. And from the infrequency of their shots, they were likely running low on ammunition. Jacob assessed the situation quickly. The men were focused entirely on the cave, unaware of his approach from behind. He had surprise on his side, but little else. 3 armed men against one with only a knife were not favorable odds. Yet there was no choice. Every minute the siege continued was another minute Hannah and the children remained in danger. Another minute for reinforcements to arrive. Another minute for the bitter cold to claim them all. Jacob moved silently closer, using the storm and the men's distraction to his advantage. He picked his target, the man furthest from the others, partially concealed behind a fallen log. As another exchange of gunfire erupted, Jacob closed the final distance and struck. His first blow was silent and lethal, the knife finding the junction of neck and shoulder with terrible precision. The man collapsed without a sound, dead before he hit the ground. Jacob claimed his revolver, checking to find 3 bullets remaining. Better odds now, 2 against 1, with the element of surprise still intact. The second man died, never knowing what hit him, a bullet to the back of the head, as he reloaded his rifle. The third, however, heard the shot and whirled in alarm. His rifle came up as he spotted Jacob advancing through the snow. They fired simultaneously. Jacob felt the burn of a bullet across his side, a searing line of fire that nearly drove him to his knees. His own shot struck more centrally, sending the man staggering backward, clutching his chest. But he didn't fall. Instead, he steadied himself against a boulder, raising his rifle for another shot. Jacob's stolen revolver clicked empty when he pulled the trigger again. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other across the snowy space, 2 wounded men in a desolate ravine, their breath clouding in the frigid air. Then Jacob charged, closing the distance before the other man could fire again. They collided violently, the rifle discharging harmlessly into the sky as they grappled. Despite his wound, the man fought with desperate strength, landing blows that sent waves of pain through Jacob's already battered body. Jacob's knife had been lost in the initial attack. He fought barehanded now, every move fueled by the knowledge that Hannah and the children were just yards away, depending on him to clear the path to safety. The struggle ended abruptly when Jacob managed to force the man's head against a sharp outcropping of rock. There was a sickening crack, and the man went limp. Jacob stood shakily, blood seeping through his coat where the bullet had grazed his ribs. He collected the fallen weapons, a rifle with 2 rounds remaining and a revolver with an unknown number, then staggered toward the cave entrance. "Moses," he called hoarsely, "it's Jacob, don't shoot." For a moment, silence answered him. Then Moses' deep voice responded cautiously, "Step forward where we can see you." Jacob moved into the open, hands partially raised despite the weapons he carried. "The men are down," he reported. 3 of them. There may be more. Moses emerged partly away from the cave, his own revolver still at the ready. When he confirmed Jacob's identity, relief washed over his weathered face. "Thank the Lord," he breathed. "We thought you were lost when the church collapsed." "Nearly was," Jacob admitted. "Boone." "Dead," Moses replied, reading the question accurately. "We heard the shot." Jacob nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion, now that the immediate danger had passed. He swayed slightly, and Moses moved quickly to support him. "You're wounded," the preacher observed, noting the blood staining Jacob's coat. "Just a graze," Jacob assured him, though the pain suggested otherwise. "The others?" "Inside, safe for now. The doctor's looking after Mary. Her fever broke during our flight." Moses helped Jacob toward the cave entrance. "Hannah's been beside herself with worry for you." The cave was shallow but deep enough to provide shelter from the wind and snow. A small fire burned near the back, casting flickering shadows across the rough walls. Hannah sat beside it, Mary cradled in her arms. Ruthie slept fitfully nearby, wrapped in what looked like Moses' coat. Clement was tending to Asa, who sat propped against the wall, his face pale but alert. When Hannah saw Jacob, she handed Mary to Clement and rushed forward. "You're alive," she whispered, her voice breaking. Without hesitation, she threw her arms around him, heedless of the blood and grime that covered him. Jacob stiffened in surprise, then slowly returned the embrace. How long had it been since anyone had held him like this? Since he'd allowed himself such simple human contact? "The papers," he said, remembering his purpose. He reached inside his coat and withdrew the oilcloth packet, now blood-stained, but intact. "They're safe." Hannah stepped back, taking the documents with trembling hands. "I thought you were dead," she said, her eyes searching his face. "When we heard the church collapse? Takes more than a falling steeple to kill a stubborn old soldier." Jacob replied with a faint smile that didn't quite mask his pain. Clement approached his medical bag in hand. "Let me see that wound," he said firmly. As the doctor examined and dressed his injury, Jacob noticed Asa watching from across the cave. The boy's right arm was bandaged, a red stain visible through the white cloth. "What happened?" Jacob asked, nodding toward Asa's wound. "One of Boone's men caught up to us just before we reached the cave," Moses explained. The boy took a bullet meant for his sister. Jacob met Asa's eyes across the fire. The boy straightened slightly under his gaze, something like pride visible through the pain. You did well, Jacob told him simply. Asa nodded once, accepting the praise without words, but clearly valuing it. When Clement finished bandaging Jacob's side, he stepped back with a frown. You've lost blood. Need rest. Food too, if we had any. There's jerky in my coat pocket, Jacob said. Not much, but something. Moses distributed the meager rations while Clement checked on Mary. The infant was awake but quiet, her breathing easier than it had been at the church. The fever's broken, the doctor confirmed. She's not out of danger yet, but if we can keep her warm and continue the medicine. We will, Hannah said with quiet determination. Jacob leaned back against the cave wall, fatigue washing over him in waves. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, the full extent of his injuries made themselves known, cracked ribs possibly from Boone's blows. The bullet grazed along his side, countless cuts and bruises, and beneath it all a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull him into unconsciousness. What now? Moses asked, settling beside him. Boone may be gone, but his men aren't all accounted for. 5 at the church, Jacob recalled. 3 here. That leaves at least 7 unaccounted for, assuming Sam's information was accurate. And they'll be looking for us, Hannah added, rejoining the conversation. For me specifically, for these. She held up the land papers. Dawn's only a few hours away, Clement observed. We can't stay here much longer. Once it's light enough to track properly. Jacob forced himself to think clearly, despite his exhaustion. Laramie's closest, but that's where Boone recruited. Not safe. My place is safer, Clement suggested. It's further, but I have supplies medicine for Mary. How far? Moses asked. 30 miles, the doctor replied. 2 days in these conditions. Jacob shook his head. Too exposed for too long. We need somewhere closer, somewhere unexpected. A memory stirred something Boone had said during their final confrontation. East Ridge by dawn. His men had a rendezvous point, which meant they wouldn't be conducting a thorough search until morning. We go back, Jacob decided. Back, Hannah echoed, confused. To the church, it's destroyed. To my cabin, Jacob clarified. It's the last place they'll look now. They've already searched it once and found it empty. Moses frowned. It's risky. If they decide to check again. Everything's risky, Jacob countered, but the cabin has supplies, shelter, defensible position. And it's closer than Laramie. We can make it by noon if we push hard. Clement considered the suggestion. The baby would do better in a proper shelter, he acknowledged. And I left most of my medical supplies there. What about Boone's men? Hannah asked, her voice tight with worry. The ones still out there. They'll be scattered, confused, Jacob replied. With Boone dead, their chain of command is broken. Some may continue the hunt, but others will cut their losses. He looked around the group. It's a gamble, but our best option. After some discussion, they agreed. They would rest for 2 more hours, then set out before dawn. The storm was easing, which would make travel easier, but would also improve visibility for any pursuers. As the others settled to rest, Hannah brought Mary to sit beside Jacob. The infant was awake, her tiny face no longer flushed with fever. She regarded Jacob with solemn eyes that seemed far older than her few weeks of life. She's stronger than she looks, Hannah said softly, adjusting the blanket around the baby. Like her mother, Jacob observed. Hannah smiled faintly. I wasn't always strong. Before Jeremiah died, I was protected, sheltered. I'd never known true hardship. Her smile faded. I've learned much since then. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the small fire and the occasional whistle of wind at the cave entrance. Why did you come back for us? Hannah asked finally. At the church. You could have escaped with the papers. Taken them to a marshal, let the law handle Boone. Jacob considered the question carefully. The law out here is flexible, he said, especially with men like Judge Norton involved. The papers alone might not have been enough. He paused. And I made a promise. To who? To myself, Jacob admitted. After Sarah and Emma died, I made a promise I'd never stand by while innocence suffered if I could prevent it. His mouth twisted in a humorless smile. I broke that promise once, with the riders. Walked away when I should have stood firm. Hannah studied his face in the firelight. What happened? Jacob was silent for so long that Hannah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low-weighted with memory. After the war, many of us couldn't settle back into civilian life. The things we'd seen done, they changed us, made peace feel foreign. He stared into the flames. Boone gathered a group of veterans, called us the Riders of Justice, said the territories needed men who understood discipline, who could enforce order where formal law hadn't reached. Vigilantes, Hannah supplied. Jacob nodded. At first, we truly sought justice. Tracked outlaws, protected settlements, escorted travelers through dangerous country. We felt purposeful again. Needed. What changed? Boone changed, Jacob said. Or perhaps he was always that way and I was too blind to see it. He began targeting anyone he deemed undesirable, immigrants primarily. Chinese laborers, Mexican farmers. Said they were stealing jobs, land. His face hardened. We became the very thing we'd once fought against, men imposing their will through violence, answerable to no one. He fell silent again. The memory's still painful after all these years. There was a farmer, he continued finally, Miguel Rodriguez. Boone claimed he'd stolen horses, but the evidence was flimsy. I argued for turning him over to the territorial court in Cheyenne. Boone overruled me. Jacob's hands clenched involuntarily. They hanged him while I watched, too cowardly to stop it. You left after that, Hannah guessed. I left, Jacob confirmed. Rode away, told myself it wasn't my responsibility. Hid in these mountains with my guilt and my memories. His eyes met hers. I won't make that mistake again. Hannah reached out, covering his clenched hand with her own. You didn't this time, she said softly. You stood against him. Saved us. Doesn't erase the past, Jacob replied. No, Hannah agreed, but it honors it, gives meaning to the loss. Before Jacob could respond, Moses approached from his position near the cave entrance. Storm's breaking, the preacher reported. Moon's visible now. We should prepare to move. They roused the others, gathering what few supplies remained. Clement checked Mary once more, administering another dose of medicine before Hannah wrapped her securely against the cold. The journey won't be easy, Jacob warned as they prepared to leave. 10 miles through snow and darkness. We'll need to move quickly, but carefully. Asa, despite his wounded arm, insisted on walking under his own power. Ruthie, still half asleep, was bundled in extra layers of clothing. Moses would carry her when she tired. As they exited the cave, Jacob scanned the ravine for any sign of movement. The 3 bodies of Boone's men lay where they had fallen, already dusted with fresh snow. He collected their weapons and ammunition, distributing them among the adults. The sky had indeed cleared somewhat, revealing a 3/4 moon that cast blue-white light across the snow-covered landscape. The wind had died to a gentle whisper, and the temperature, while still well below freezing, no longer carried the bitter edge that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. We follow the creek back to where it meets the trail, Jacob instructed. Then north to the cabin. Stay close, watch for signals, and make as little noise as possible. They set off in single file, Jacob leading, Moses bringing up the rear. Progress was slow but steady, each step carrying them closer to safety, or so they hoped. By the time they reached the trail junction, the eastern sky had begun to lighten. Dawn was approaching, and with it, increased danger of discovery. Jacob set a faster pace, pushing the group as hard as he dared, considering their various injuries and exhaustion. They were perhaps 2 miles from the cabin when Clement, who had been watching their back trail, whispered urgently, "Riders!" Jacob turned, squinting into the gathering light. In the distance, 3 horsemen were visible, moving along the trail they had just traveled. Whether they were following their specific tracks or simply patrolling was unclear, but the danger was immediate either way. Into the trees, Jacob ordered, guiding the group off the trail and into the denser pine forest that flanked it. Stay low, move quickly. They pushed through the snow-laden undergrowth branches, whipping at their faces as they hurried deeper into the cover. Behind them, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, then slowed. They've seen our tracks leaving the trail, Moses murmured. Jacob nodded grimly. No way to hide their path through fresh snow. Keep moving, he urged. The cabin's not far. They increased their pace to something just short of a run, Hannah clutching Mary tightly to her chest, Ruthie being half carried by Moses. Asa kept up admirably, despite his wound, his young face set in determination. The riders had definitely spotted their trail now. Shouts echoed through the forest, followed by the sound of horses crashing through underbrush. There, Clement pointed ahead where the outline of Jacob's cabin was just visible through the trees. They broke it from the forest edge into the cleared area around the structure, racing for the door. Jacob reached it first, throwing it open and ushering the others inside. As Moses entered last with Ruthie, a shot rang out from the tree line. "Get down!" Jacob shouted, slamming the door closed and dropping to a crouch beside the window. Through the frost-edged glass, he could see the three riders emerging from the forest, rifles raised. Two remained mounted, while the third dismounted, advancing cautiously toward the cabin. "Jacob Harrow," the man called. "We know you're in there. Send out the woman and the papers, and the rest of you can leave." "Norton's men," Clement whispered from his position beside the door. "I recognize the one in front works as a bailiff in the judge's court." Jacob checked his ammunition, 5 rounds in the revolver, 2 in the rifle he'd taken from Boone's man. Not enough for a prolonged fight. "How many bullets do you have?" he asked Moses. 3 in the revolver, and the preacher replied. "That's all." Hannah had positioned herself in the corner, furthest from the window, sheltering Mary and Ruthie with her body. Asa crouched nearby, the Whitney revolver clutched in his good hand. "What do we do?" Hannah asked, her voice remarkably steady, given the circumstances. Jacob considered their options. They were outnumbered, low on ammunition, and had wounded and children to protect. Yet surrender meant certain death or worse. "We negotiate," he decided. "Buy time." He moved to the window, staying low but making himself visible enough to be seen. "What guarantee do we have that you'll let anyone go?" he called back. The dismounted man, the bailiff, stepped forward. "Judge Norton's word," he replied. "He just wants what's his by right." "Nothing here belongs to Norton," Jacob countered. "The ranch is legally Hannah Grace's property. The papers prove it." "Papers can be disputed," the bailiff argued, "especially when signed under duress. The judge is willing to be generous. Let the woman and children go to Laramie with safe passage. All he wants is the documentation." Jacob glanced at Hannah, who shook her head firmly. They both knew what would happen if the papers were surrendered. Norton and his allies would seize Echo Valley, and Hannah would have no legal recourse. "We need time to discuss your offer," Jacob called, stalling. "You have 5 minutes," the bailiff responded. "Then we come in shooting." Jacob turned back to the others. "They're lying," he said quietly. "If we give up the papers, they'll kill us all to eliminate witnesses." "What choice do we have?" Clement asked, his normally confident demeanor shaken. "We're trapped, outnumbered." "Not necessarily," Moses interjected. "While you were unconscious at the cave, Hannah showed me the papers. There's something you should know." All eyes turned to Hannah, who nodded grimly. "The deed to Echo Valley isn't the only document in that packet," she explained. "There's also a letter from Judge Norton to Jeremiah dated 2 weeks before his death. In it, Norton proposes a scheme to force small ranchers off their land using falsified tax records." "Evidence of corruption," Jacob realized. "More than that," Hannah continued. "Conspiracy, fraud, possibly murder. Jeremiah was gathering evidence against Norton and Boone when he fell ill. He suspected they might have poisoned him." This revelation cast everything in a new light. The papers weren't just legal documents. They were potential dynamite that could destroy Norton's career and freedom. "That's why they've been so determined to find you," Clement said, understanding dawning. "It's not just about the ranch. It's about survival," Jacob agreed. "For them as much as for us." A plan began to form in his mind, desperate perhaps, but with a chance of success where simple resistance offered none. "Norton doesn't know what we have," he reasoned. "He thinks it's just the deed. If we could get that letter to the right authorities." "The territorial governor," Clement suggested immediately. "He and Norton have been at odds for years. He'd act on solid evidence of corruption." "Cheyenne's 100 miles from here," Moses pointed out. "Laramie has a telegraph office," Jacob countered. "We could send word request immediate assistance." "They'd intercept any messenger," Hannah objected. "Not if they didn't know one was sent," Jacob replied, his plan taking clearer shape. "We need a diversion." Outside, the bailiff's voice called again. 3 minutes left, Harrow." Jacob moved swiftly to the loose floorboard beneath his bed, prying it up to reveal a small cache he'd hoped never to use again, his service revolver from the war fully loaded, and a small box of ammunition. "I'll go out," he said, checking the weapon. "Claim to have the papers. While they're focused on me, Moses slips out the back with the actual documents and makes for Laramie. "They'll kill you," Hannah protested. "Not immediately," Jacob replied. "They'll want to verify the papers first. By the time they realize they have been deceived, Moses will have reached Laramie." "It's suicide," Clement stated flatly. "It's our best chance," Jacob countered. "Unless anyone has a better idea." Silence met his question. The hard truth was that their options were severely limited. "I should be the one to go," Hannah said suddenly. "I'm who they want. They might hesitate to harm a woman." "No," Jacob and Asa said simultaneously. "We need another way," Moses insisted. Jacob was about to respond when a familiar sound caught his attention. Hoofbeats, but not from the direction of the three men outside. These came from the north, from the direction of Laramie. He moved cautiously to the side window, peering out toward the sound. His eyes widened at what he saw. "Riders," he reported. "At least a dozen. Coming fast." "More of Norton's men?" Clement asked anxiously. Jacob continued watching as the new arrivals came into clearer view. "No," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. That's Marshal Taylor at the front, and those look like deputies with him." Hope, fragile but real, bloomed in the cabin. "How?" Hannah breathed. "Who could have sent for them?" The answer came when Jacob spotted a familiar figure riding beside the Marshal Sam Blackwood, the old trapper who had given him the Elkshorn route for Mary. "Sam," Jacob said, understanding dawning. "He must have gone to Laramie after we met on the trail, realized the danger and fetched help." They watched as the marshal's posse approached the three men outside the cabin. Brief words were exchanged, too distant to hear clearly. Then, to Jacob's surprise, the bailiff and his companions surrendered without resistance, hands raising slowly into the air. "They're giving up," Moses observed, incredulous. "Hired guns," Jacob explained. "Loyal to money, not causes. With Boone dead and the law present in force." The tension that had gripped the cabin began to ease, though none of them quite believed their ordeal might be ending. They watched as Marshal Taylor's men disarmed and secured the three riders, then approached the cabin. "Jacob Harrow," Taylor called. "It's Marshal Taylor from Laramie. You and your companions can come out. It's safe now." Still cautious, Jacob opened the door slowly, rifle ready just in case. But there was no deception. Taylor stood before the cabin with 12 deputies, while the bailiff and his companions sat disarmed on their horses under guard. "Marshal," Jacob acknowledged, lowering his weapon slightly. "This is unexpected." Taylor, a grizzled veteran of frontier law enforcement, nodded grimly. "Got word from Blackwood that you and the Grace woman were in danger. Said Boone Mallory had formed a gang calling themselves Riders of Justice and were hunting you." He glanced at the captured men. "Found these three planning an ambush. They surrendered quick enough when they saw our numbers." "Boone's dead," Jacob informed him. "Killed when the old church collapsed during the fight." Taylor nodded, unsurprised. "Blackwood mentioned you might be headed there. We found the ruins on our way here. Saw the body." He studied Jacob's battered appearance. "Looks like you've been through hell." "Something like that," Jacob agreed. The others had emerged from the cabin now, Hannah carrying Mary Moses, supporting Ruthie Clement, checking Asa's bandaged arm. Taylor's eyes widened slightly at the sight of them, especially the children. "Mrs. Grace," he greeted Hannah formally, "I've heard much about your situation. Judge Norton has been making some serious claims regarding your husband's property." Hannah straightened, meeting the marshal's gaze directly. "I have documentation proving my legal ownership," she said, "and evidence of conspiracy between Norton and Boone Mallory to seize land illegally throughout Echo Valley." Taylor's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious accusation." "There's serious evidence to support it," Hannah replied, nodding toward the papers Jacob still carried. The marshal considered this, then made a decision. "I'd like to see that evidence," he said, "and then I think we all need to have a conversation with the territorial governor." As Taylor's men secured the area and tended to their various injuries, Jacob found himself standing apart, watching the activity with a strange sense of detachment. After days of desperate struggle, the sudden presence of law and order seemed almost unreal. Hannah approached Mary, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "It's over," she said quietly. "Thanks to you." Jacob shook his head. "Thanks to Sam," he corrected, "and Marshal Taylor. They wouldn't have come if you hadn't fought for us first," Hannah insisted. "If you hadn't taken us in that night." Jacob had no response to that. His actions had seemed inevitable at the time, each step following naturally from the one before. From the moment Hannah had knocked on his door, Had he ever truly had a choice? What happens now, he asked instead. The marshal wants us to travel to Cheyenne, Hannah replied, to present the evidence to the governor directly. He's sending for a wagon to transport us. Jacob nodded. It made sense. The territorial capital was the safest place for Hannah and the children until Norton's influence was neutralized. You'll be safe there, he said. Can start rebuilding your life at Echo Valley once Norton's dealt with. Hannah studied his face. And you, what will you do? Jacob hadn't thought that far ahead. Return to his solitary existence. After everything that had happened, the prospect held little appeal. I don't know, he admitted. Come with us, Hannah said, the words simple but weighted with meaning. To Cheyenne, and after, to Echo Valley if you want. Jacob looked at her in surprise. You'd want that? The children need you, Hannah said softly. Asa looks up to you. Ruthie trusts you. She hesitated. And I've come to depend on your strength. The admission clearly cost her something. Hannah Grace was not a woman accustomed to acknowledging dependency of any kind. Before Jacob could respond, Moses joined them, his weathered face serene despite the trials of the past days. The marshal says, we'll leave for Cheyenne tomorrow, the preacher reported. Once everyone's had a chance to rest and recover a bit. Jacob nodded acknowledgement, still processing Hannah's invitation. Moses glanced between them, a knowing look in his eyes. I've been thinking, he said casually. That old church of your father's, the foundation's still solid despite the fire. I suppose, Jacob agreed, wondering at the change of subject. People in these parts could use a place of worship, Moses continued, and a community gathering point, somewhere to find shelter in storms, both literal and figurative. Jacob began to see where the preacher was heading. You thinking of rebuilding it? With help, Moses confirmed. These hills have good people scattered through them. Folks like Sam Blackwood. Like the families who'll return to Echo Valley once Norton's gone. He paused. They need a shepherd, Jacob. I left that life behind, Jacob said, though with less conviction than he might have a week ago. Did you, Moses asked gently? Or did you just lose your way for a time, many have after seeing what war shows of man's capacity for cruelty? Hannah shifted Mary to her other arm, her eyes never leaving Jacob's face. Your father built that church after loss, she said quietly. Perhaps it's meant to rise again for the same reason. Jacob looked between them, these two people who had entered his life so suddenly and changed it so completely. Then his gaze moved to the others, Asa sitting proudly as Clement rebandaged his wounded arm. Ruthie sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Marshal Taylor and his men bringing order where chaos had reigned. And finally to Mary Tinyface, relaxed in sleep, unaware of how close she had come to death or of the sacrifices made to ensure her survival. A new life full of possibility untainted by the past. I'm not the man I was, Jacob said finally. Not the preacher who left Pennsylvania all those years ago. Not sure I can find those certainties again. Perhaps you are not meant to, Moses suggested. Perhaps you're meant to find new ones, deeper ones tempered by experience. Hannah's free hand found Jacob's, her fingers intertwining with his. You don't have to decide now, she said. Just come with us. See what might be possible. Jacob looked down at their joined hands, then up at the vast Wyoming sky now clear and blue after the storm. Somewhere in that expanse, he thought he could almost hear Sarah's voice and Emma's laughter, not as ghosts haunting him, but as memories blessing him, giving him permission to live again. All right, he said simply. I'll come. The decision felt neither momentous nor trivial. Just right, like a key turning in a lock too long unused. Whatever lay ahead, rebuilding the church, helping restore Echo Valley, creating a new kind of family from the broken pieces of old, ones he would face it with these people who had somehow become his own. In the hills where mercy had taken root in stone and snow and fire, Jacob Harrow. Once a man alone had found his purpose, not in vengeance, not in mere survival, but in love and family, and in the fierce holy promise to protect what had once come to him in hunger and now stayed out of choice. It was enough. It was everything. End of part 5, story complete.